The Scientific Search for Spirit. This is a sociology of science project. I am interested in how knowledge about consciousness and survival is constructed. I've been doing this work for about a year now, including last fall when I was on sabbatical. And this was partly supported by a grant from Gettysburg College. So far, I've interviewed 21 people, mostly scientists or academics, who are interested in survival. I've also done participant observation at research organizations and professional conferences like this one. And there's a lot of literature to review, although I have not actually read The Complete Idiot's Guide to Near-Death Experiences.
Is that a real book?
Yes. It is.
Yes.
Yes, I have one. I own it.
Yes, he's got one.
And I read it.
Now, the kinds of things that we could group under consciousness and survival, I have on this slide. Although, of course, many parapsychologists would talk about overlap between the two categories. So, for example, NDEs might provide evidence for survival, and spirit mediumship might just be psi among the living or clairvoyance. Here are some handy concepts for looking at this in terms of sociology of science. So that Thomas Kuhn talking about paradigms and Irving Goffman frames, those are nice ways of seeing these things as people processing data through a certain perspective. And I have the Tinker Toy house on the left to illustrate social construction, whereas my amino acid molecule glycine on the right, that's real. That's objectively real. Now, of course, I tell my students all the time that the map is not the territory. There's no such thing as a model or a concept which has an absolute one-to-one correspondence with reality. Language games, Jean-François Lyotard. One of the language games played in science is to talk about anecdotal, in the sense of merely anecdotal evidence. So that if you set up a linguistic frame in which elite science is replicable, controlled laboratory experiments, and everything else is just anecdotal, then of course that marginalizes humanities as a way of knowing anything. It also marginalizes social science, in which laboratory methodology is rarely appropriate. Also, Stanley Aronowitz in Science is Power talks about how science uses an ideology to protect itself, protect its interests. Now, one of the main cultural splits here that's relevant for talking about spirituality, survival, and consciousness is the split between religion and science, which most people don't realize actually got a whole lot wider after Darwin than it was before Darwin. And by the end of the 1800s, the professionalization of science made it very difficult for spiritualists to claim that their seances, I mean, they didn't have university degrees, so how could they claim that they were providing in their seances evidence for survival or consciousness after a so-called death? Also, serious scientists, even ones with Nobel Prizes in London, who wanted to test spirit mediums, were ignored because their research was in a taboo area. It was too close to science. I mean, that's a slip, I guess. Too close to religion. Now, what's my role in all of this? I think I'm doing a kind of applied sociology. It actually just dawned on me while I was preparing this talk. This is applied sociology. Now, as you can see, I tend to lean a little toward the social constructionist perspective. However, I'm not a radical postmodernist. I don't claim that science is impossible. I don't say that truth is only what we all say it is. I'm a kind of a moderate, and I actually think that I can look, I'm probably kidding myself, right? I think that I can look at all these frames and use a kind of sociological filter, take a holistic look of all these things, and learn from it all and put it all together. We'll see in a few years. I'm sure you're all aware that the biggest stumbling block in this kind of research is the normal science decision that certain topics are okay to study and others are not. Robert K. Merton, a sociologist, talked about how the scientific ideal, the ethos of science, includes open inquiry and objectivity. He was really dreaming, I think, but that was a nice try. In reality, see, I go with Stanley Aronowitz, being a radical leftist myself. Stanley Aronowitz talks about science as power, in which actually establishment science has an ideology that claims objectivity when it's really not. And I like when Aronowitz says that the ideology of science is that science has no ideology. We're the experts, it's only a method. Where's your degree? Where's your NSF grant to study mediumship? You don't count. End of story. So it shouldn't be that certain subjects are just not allowed, just completely deviant to even ask questions about, but that's what happens. And as J. Allen Hynek, the astronomer and UFO researcher said, science is not always what scientists do. He also said that ridicule is not part of the scientific method, but ridicule is a strong aspect of social control in normal science. I use the word normal science to talk about the control system of science. So what I hope to do is to transcend any one frame on consciousness and survival and attempt to see what it all means. I like to do a sympathetic reading of all these things, the kind of reading you don't get when you submit your article to a journal. You know what I mean? I would like to get a sympathetic reading, actually try to understand from all these perspectives in the true spirit of science. And by the way, if you let it leak out as a sociologist that you're not just interested in how scientists look at survival, but admit that you actually care if there is such a thing as survival, you're in the sociological doghouse. And that's me in the doghouse losing my religion. I'm used to being in the doghouse because of other things that I've done, other studies I've done, such as my study of UFO researchers, in which I interviewed 91 UFO researchers and I read the literature to try to figure out how and why this subject was labeled as deviant science. And also to find out the subcultures of different frames that various ufologists used. So that you could say that there's a subculture of nuts and bolts ufologists and a new age wing of ufology, and this is hemmed in on two sides by normal science debunkers and UFO cults on the other. And there's a similar parallel in red down here with subcultures that have something to do with consciousness and survival. Let me give you some examples of what I found so far in my interviews and observations. This one institute that I observed is strongly applied. Now, they do research, and they are science-based, and they want to avoid any particular religious tag, but they assume the existence of consciousness and survival and do applied workshops. So people are having out-of-body experiences and doing spirit rescues and so on. And the one former director of research that I talked to said, yes, I've spent many years researching what I already know to be true. In other words, experience is primary. I'm just looking at the clock. I guess you look at my watch. Experience is primary, and he had experiences as a child that gave him no doubt that there was consciousness apart from the body. I interviewed one philosophy professor who is truly exquisite in the way he discusses the various perspectives on survival. It's the best stuff that I've read, actually. And then he threw me for a loop when I asked him about quantum physics and how it might apply, and he said it's just irrelevant. And I'm still processing this and trying to understand his perspective. But basically what's going on here is that he thinks that issues of mediumship or whatever is apparent survival, it's a behavioral science question, basically, although I'm oversimplifying his point of view, and that to reduce that down to a physics problem is reductionism. So you could say that this is an example of disciplinary differences in how to look at this problem. One lab scientist I interviewed said that there's a tendency for people interested in remote viewing, when you ask them about survival, possible survival cases like in spirit mediumship, to apply a psi explanation, not to mention any names here, but that people who investigate spirit mediumship are more likely to go for a survival explanation.